go. So Nick, could you start off by telling us a bit about your background with MOD and what you did there?
I worked for the British government for 21 years at the Ministry of Defence, and I did a number of different tours of duty in that time. From 1991 to 1994, I was responsible for investigating UFO sightings, and through that I got drawn into other mysteries such as crop circles.
And would you like to tell us about when the MOD first became involved in crop circles?
The MOD's first involvement in the crop circle mystery was in 1985 when an angry farmer complained that military helicopters had been flying low over his land and making strange patterns damaging his crops. The Army Air Corps sent out somebody to investigate this, and sure enough there were strange patterns in the fields. He then took an aerial photograph and attended a meeting, the main point of which was to reassure the farmer that the downwash from the helicopter's rotor blades could not have caused these patterns. Now, Colonel Edgecombe, who was the man leading this investigation, then sent a report together with the photographs that he'd taken to Ministry of Defence headquarters in London. And because he'd never really come across anything like this before, the only place he could think of to send it was to the UFO project.
Excellent. And what were his findings upon examining this? That it wasn't rotor wash, that it was in fact some other cause, the circles?
When Colonel Edgecombe investigated the first sighting reported to the MOD, his main conclusion was a negative one. In other words, what it wasn't was military helicopters. He was less sure about what it was, and I think he held off from speculating too much on that. But the favourite theory at the time was that we were dealing with some sort of meteorological phenomena.
So, weather patterns, this was, and this is what the Minister of Agriculture in 1989 talked about as well, that it was actually Mr. Ryder, is that correct? Flattening of crop, sorry, one sec. So, yeah, here we go, I'm sorry. It was the Environmental Secretary, Nicholas Ridley?
Yes.
Can you talk about what Nicholas Ridley concluded that this was, in fact I'll read you his quote and then you can comment. Most likely to result crop circles from a combination of wind and local soil fertility conditions in cereals which are prone to lodging. Can you kind of explain his position, the wind phenomena? Is that something that was explained at the time as a possible cause?
In the early days of crop circle research, the government was asked about this, and questions were asked in Parliament to both the Secretary of State for Defence and indeed other parts of the government, Environment, Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food. They were all peripherally involved with this because no one really knew what they were dealing with. The earliest theories, and this was put forward by Nicholas Ridley, a government minister, was that what we were really dealing with was a combination of wind and some local soil conditions that perhaps might mean that a strong wind could lay down the crops in certain areas and not in the surrounding field. But effectively, this was little more than guesswork, and there was very little hard science being done on any of this.
I'm going to have to stop you real quick and stop these cameras.
The whole last one that we've got to do again, or?
It's up to Alex. I heard it in my ears, but it depends if it's
like the last 4 or 5 words that started. I don't think you need to do it all over again.
Okay, I'll
Do you, so do we need it again or not?
I don't think so.
Okay, great. So then my next question would be, since then obviously the phenomena has grown and the crop circles have become more and more elaborate. Does that still stand as an explanation from the government, or have they now moved on to a more elaborate source for the crop circle formation?
The meteorological theory in relation to crop circles, in other words, that we're talking about mini whirlwinds or wind vortices, was really only tenable in the early days when we were dealing with simple circles or the quintuplets. But I think the moment we got into more elaborate patterns, the so-called pictograms, it was clear that the meteorological theory was completely false.
So have the government revised their position on crop circles, or are they still sticking to the meteorological? Have they moved on? Is there a new explanation offered by them, or are they just not discussing it?
So far as I'm aware, the government takes no position at present on the nature of the crop circle phenomena. So the parliamentary questions that were given in the 80s, which were really speculative, although they're on the record, that shouldn't be taken as a current government statement.
Okay. Let's get back to MOD. It was said, again, referring to the 1989 parliamentary sessions, it was said that the MOD is not conducting any inquiries into the origins of flattened circular areas of crop. Was that true at the time? Is it true today?
There was a parliamentary question where the answer from the MOD was that the department was conducting no research and investigation into the crop circle phenomenon. That, so far as I am aware, was true at the time. It ceased being true when I took over in 1991, because although crop circles were not formally in my terms of reference, it was impossible not to get drawn into the mystery because of the perceived link between crop circles and UFOs.
I hear the employees just whistling and kicking doors open and stuff.
I'll stay outside. Yeah, I don't know what that is, but that's
I think someone just flushed a toilet, actually.
Yeah.
The largest toilet I've ever.
How was that last one, or do we need to go again?
I would recommend going again on that last one. Are you going to stay on this there?
You would?
Yeah.
Okay.
That was pretty loud.
Okay, this was about the 1989 question.
The 1989
Okay.
question, the MOD is not conducting
okay.
any inquiries into the origins of the flattened circular areas of crop. That was their position back then. Is it still their position now? Have they changed?
In response to a parliamentary question tabled in 1989, the Ministry of Defence answered that they were not carrying out any inquiries into the crop circle phenomenon. So far as I'm aware, that was true at the time. It ceased being true in 1991 when I took over responsibility for the UFO project, because I felt it was impossible not to make some inquiries into the crop circle phenomenon because of the link that people were making with UFOs. In other words, many people believed there was a connection, so the two became entangled so far as my work was concerned.
Okay. Can you talk to us a little bit about that work while you were while the file was open on crop circles, and maybe what interested you about the phenomenon when you first heard about it?
Crop circles were not in my terms of reference, but I effectively found a way to keep an eye on developments, and effectively I think it's true to say that while I wasn't spending government money, taxpayers' money, going out into the fields, I was able to do that in a private capacity on occasion, and I kept what you would call a watching brief on the phenomenon. It was very interesting to me. Clearly we were dealing with something that was evolutionary. It was clear that we were starting off we'd started off in the 80s with single circles. Then we saw these quintuplets, a circle with 4 satellite circles. And after that, we saw increasingly complex patterns, the so-called pictograms. So something, whatever was involved here, it was evolutionary, not static, and that was interesting to me.
I see. And during this time, did you conduct any tests on formations that you found?
During my tour of duty, I didn't conduct any tests. I would have liked to have done, but that would have involved using government funding, and there were very strict rules on what we could do that for. But of course there were things that I wanted to do, for example to take soil samples from within a crop circle formation and analyse it in a double-blind experiment with a control sample from the same field but outside the formation. I would have wanted to have done exactly the same with the crop itself, to see whether, as some civilian researchers were suggesting, there was changes at a cellular level in any of the crops.
That leads me to my next question, which is about BLT, Burke, Levengood and Talbot. Are you familiar with them and the research that they've done using the scientific method?
Burke, Levengood and Talbot BLT are effectively a consortium of private researchers, civilians, who have made a scientific study of the crop circle phenomenon. They claim to have found some changes in the crops in formations that are not found outside. Now that's very, as we say in the MOD, interesting if true. I think the challenge to BLT will be to write this up in the form of a paper that can be peer-reviewed and then published in one of the major scientific journals, such as Nature or Scientific American, because until it passes that litmus test, I think a lot of people are fairly sceptical.
In fact, BLT's research has been peer-reviewed, just not in the publications you mentioned. And what they have found is, I don't know if you're familiar with this, maybe you can talk about it, something called aspical node length, which is the top joint of a stalk of wheat or barley. It becomes elongated when it's acted upon, theoretically, by some kind of energy. Are you familiar with this?
I'm broadly familiar with some of BLT's conclusions about changes in the nodes, where they claim that crop that has been interacted on by some unknown force, there are changes in the length of the nodes. But again, I come back to the point on all this. Yes, some of their material has been peer-reviewed, but there's peer review and there's peer review. And from my broadly sceptical approach, and that was the approach that I had to adopt, certainly within government, until I see this in something like Scientific American and Nature, I'm not really going to believe it. It's one thing to have it written up in a UFO magazine or a crop circle publication, but until you get it into those major mainstream journals, you won't be taken seriously by the scientific community.
Okay. We actually brought a sample for you to examine. It's an expulsion cavity, and we've talked to several farmers and scientists about this, and they can't offer us a single rational explanation. It's that joint there, if you want to take a look. What do you know about expulsion cavities, and how would you explain them?
I'm really not an expert on these so-called expulsion cavities, these little marks here, I guess. I think obviously you would need a scientist to really comment on this. It could be due to some sort of pest, I guess. I don't know what bugs are in the field and perhaps feed on these crops, or there could be some perfectly rational explanation for this. Yes, it's very interesting, but I'm really not qualified to comment on it.
Okay, thank you. Okay, moving on. Let's talk about the flyovers, because that's really interesting. The military helicopters, Apache gunships, are often seen over the formations. Can you talk about that and why that might be happening?
Many crop circle researchers get very excited by the fact that military helicopters are often seen in the vicinity of crop circles. Now, there's no doubt in my mind that's true, and clearly on many occasions they've been caught on film, so that's not disputed. Crop circle researchers, though, read far more into this military presence around the formations than I think I do. They think that the government is either monitoring the phenomenon itself, or they believe that crop circle researchers are actively being harassed by low-flying helicopters buzzing them. Neither of those, to my mind, are true. What I think's going on is this. Those areas of England where crop circles are most prevalent are amongst the most popular areas for the military to conduct their low-flying training. Now, crop circles make a useful navigational marker. In other words, they're quite visible from the air, so it's quite possible that in a training sortie, a navigator will actually say, set your bearings by this big crop circle formation in this particular field. Another explanation for the presence of military helicopters near crop circles is the simple fact that the pilots are just as interested and intrigued by these patterns as anyone else. And I've certainly spoken in my government career to many pilots who were fascinated by these things and quite freely admitted to planning their low-flying training in the area where these things had been reported so that they could get some great photos for the crew room wall. Recently, a lot of people have said that they've seen Apache gunships in that area, and that's certainly true. Again, Apache helicopters do train in Wiltshire, Somerset, Hampshire, those sorts of areas. I mean, it's worth bearing in mind, of course, that a large proportion of Wiltshire is actually military land, so it shouldn't surprise people that they're seeing military helicopters in these sorts of areas. The Apaches, of course, the work-up training that they're doing in England is a prelude to what will almost certainly be their next tour of duty when they deploy to Afghanistan. So low flying is a big part of that. You have to go in fast and quick to infiltrate or exfiltrate, for example, troops. So again, people who see helicopters around crop circles and think there's something sinister, no, it's just military training.
Okay. We actually have some friends who filmed an Apache, in fact maybe it wasn't an Apache, but it was clearly a military helicopter, chasing what appeared to be an orb of light. Have you heard of these orbs, these balls of light? And why would a helicopter be pursuing one of those?
I've seen a piece of film footage where there's a helicopter apparently chasing a so-called orb, in other words, a ball of light. Now, this is a phenomenon that may or may not be connected to UFOs and or crop circles, but certainly a number of the researchers think it is. I've looked at that footage. Yes, it does appear that the helicopter is following this ball of light. Obviously, one explanation is the pilot saw it and was curious. But another possibility is we don't really know whether from the pilot's point of view it was visible. Clearly it was visible from the person taking the photo, but the pilot was at a completely different angle, so it may just be coincidence.
While we're talking about balls of light, is that something MOD has ever been interested in, related or otherwise to crop circles?
The Ministry of Defence has certainly received reports of balls of light in among the 200 or 300 UFO sightings that they receive each year. Now, it's a matter of debate both within the MOD, when I was there, and indeed in the civilian research community as to the extent of the link between UFOs, balls of light, and crop circles. But, even some of the skeptics who claim to be, in some cases, the very people who make some of these formations, even those people will tell you sometimes that they do see these strange balls of light.
You've led me in nicely to discussing the hoaxes. When did you first, at MOD, when did you first learn that these could be man-made, and when did you first come into contact with some of these hoaxes?
It was clear to me when I saw the first pictograms that suddenly the meteorological explanation was looking less likely, and what was looking to be the favourite theory was that these things were being made by people. Actually, if you look at the early pictograms, they're not very good, and this is exactly what you would expect if people were making them. In other words, you start with something very basic, a circle, Then you start making some embellishments, and then you think, well, I'll make a more complex pattern. But when you make your first few patterns, you won't be very good at it. You won't have really practiced, and the first ones will be a little bit rough. The lines won't be straight, and that's exactly what happened. In the summer of 1991, which was actually when I joined the UFO project, there were a number of quite spectacular pictograms being reported in the fields. Perhaps the best known one was the so-called Mandelbrot set, which many people thought used fractal imagery from chaos mathematics. The storm broke, I guess, in the autumn of that season when the Daily Express ran a front page headline exposing the activities of two amiable chaps, Doug and Dave, who effectively put their hands up and said, "We did it. We've been hoaxing the world. We are the two guys who've been making these crop circles with planks of wood, bits of string, and a sight made from a bent piece of wire on a baseball cap."
Given the sheer quantity of circles over the years, how likely is it that Doug and Dave were responsible for all these early formations in the first 10 years?
When Doug and Dave confessed to being responsible for crop circles, I don't think even they were claiming that they were the only ones. They certainly believed that they were the first, but it's my understanding that they certainly acknowledged that others had probably followed their work and in many cases improved upon it. So I don't think it's fair to say that because Doug and Dave couldn't possibly have done all the circles, that there's something more sinister going on. No, I think the truth of the matter is Doug and Dave were just one of a number of different groups of people making these formations.
We've talked to architects and designers, and they say that the level of training and knowledge that would be required to put one of these down, to locate it, is beyond your average layperson. How would you respond to that vis-a-vis Doug and Dave?
I think when you have a situation where architects and designers are commenting on crop circles, it's a very dangerous area because effectively they're talking about their expertise when in fact the art of making a crop circle is really rather different despite the apparent similarities. Now yes, I'm sure you can find people who will say no, you couldn't possibly do that, but you'll find people who will go out and make these things for you, and crop circles have been used extensively, for example, in major advertising campaigns. So we know full well that there are people, whatever the skeptics say, there are people who can produce these most complex formations if they have enough time and, in many cases, enough people on the team. I think that's something that people often forget. People say, how could two people do this in, say, 3 or 4 hours of darkness in the summer months? Well, sometimes the answer is there's huge teams of people.
I guess this is a little off track, but have the government or the MOD, have they ever issued any D notices, any gag orders relating to crop circles or the study of?
I'm certainly not aware of any instances where the government has issued a D notice, these defence notices which preclude the media from reporting something. These things are used, for example, with stories about nuclear technology. They're used with stories that talk about the intelligence community. I've never come across a case of a D notice being used to prevent a story about UFOs or crop circles being published. Now, some people in the crop circle community have claimed that a D notice has been used on maybe one or more than one occasions to kill a story on crop circles. As I say, as far as I'm aware, that's not true. It's just possible that what happened in one case was, bear in mind, these are areas that the military use extensively for training. It's possible that people filming a story about crop circles stumbled across a special forces exercise, for example, surveillance, and took photos of military people and that therefore a D notice was used to prevent pictures of special forces operatives being published. But that's speculation on my part. I don't know that for sure. I'm just throwing it into the arena as a potential explanation. I think it's more likely, however, that no D notice was issued at all.
In your opinion, and in the MOD's opinion, when you were working with them, could crop circles have ever been a national security issue of sorts?
I wasn't convinced that crop circles posed any national security issue. The UFO phenomenon was different, and with a handful of the cases, there were clear defence, national security, and indeed air safety issues. Self-evidently, if a pilot reports, as has happened on a number of cases, near misses with UFOs in British airspace, then that is of interest. A pattern in the fields, frankly, yes, it's very interesting, but it's not a defence issue.
Okay. Just moving on, sorry. How are you doing?
Yeah, fine. I didn't mention, maybe you've got it, but perhaps mention about the accusations. It probably does tie in with the last question, that what we were looking at was a sort of directed energy weapon being used or something. So
okay, yeah.
Perhaps I'll just speak to that.
Go ahead, you don't even need me to prompt you. You're right there. I mean, you're talking about Tesla ray, the potential that it's a maser or some kind of space station, Kevlar space station, Mylar. Is that what you're talking about?
In my time on the UFO project, I found myself on the receiving end of all sorts of questions and, in some cases, accusations about crop circles and military involvement. One of the theories that was certainly doing the rounds in the early 90s was the idea that these formations might be caused by some sort of space-based directed energy weapon. My response to that was I thought it highly unlikely. I'd certainly come across no such technology. And of course, with the military being really, aside from the Crown, the largest landowner in the United Kingdom, if we were testing such a weapon or device, we certainly wouldn't have done it in farmers' fields, but on military land. Other people felt that the Ministry of Defence was involved in the phenomenon and that it was some kind of psyop, a psychological operation, that it was designed in some way to influence people's beliefs. Again, it was a very colourful theory, but not one borne out by the facts.
So kind of led me into this question. Has MOD of the military, have they actually studied the possibility that this crop is irradiated, that it might be exuding some kind of energy diffusion pattern?
I'm not aware that the Ministry of Defence has ever looked at issues of radioactivity in the crop fields, and indeed I would be inclined to say that if that was an issue, it's probably not a policy issue for the Ministry of Defence, but rather for the government department charged with agricultural issues.
I've got a question here. In 1990, Dennis Healy said in a TV interview that he thought that government inquiry into crop circles was unnecessary, that it's clearly a natural phenomenon. Do you agree with that statement?
The politician Dennis Healy said some years ago that he felt a government inquiry into crop circles was unnecessary because he thought it was a natural phenomenon. He may be right, but I think given the fact that this mystery now has been running for several decades, there is something to be said for launching a small-scale official inquiry into this to try and put the mystery to bed once and for all and to resolve these various issues and accusations.
While you were at MOD, did you push for an investigation of that kind?
I did push for some more proactive stance to be taken on this, but I was fighting a very difficult corner because the UFO project itself was under some threat with various competing demands on the defence budget. A lot of people felt that spending taxpayers' money on UFOs was a waste of time, so I would be very hard pushed to persuade them to expand our terms of reference to doing anything more involved with crop circles than the watching brief that I had.
Wait,
How are we
can
doing
we
with
do
that?
that?
That's
I
Okay.
need to fix the
crazy.
slide is us going nuts. Yeah, that's what is going on. Oh.
Could you just open the door maybe and ask Hutch about, someone keeps walking.
This isn't it. I'm just gonna do something while he's checking
Someone
this
keeps
out.
walking back and forth right over us.
It's really, I don't know if it's necessary to do it 18 times in there.
Is there any way maybe talk to people upstairs about why?
Someone keeps walking right over.
Are they opening right now, or
I
what's
think they might be.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's 12 o'clock. They've probably hit.
Okay. We're just gonna have to soldier on out.
I'll,
Is that something we can
It
deal
wasn't
with?
that bad.
I'll
Okay.
do shorter sound bites so you can kind of.
I mean, I heard it. Can we redo that last one though?
Okay.
I really also, because if the sun keeps changing.
Because they're setting tables, but they're done.
Thanks, mate.
We should go back. I need to get it for. Kid walk all the way back.
So Dennis Healy,
Yeah.
we're doing that again.
Yeah.
Okay.
If you wouldn't mind. The 1990 interview, government inquiry.
Was it
on
1990? Was it?
Mhm.
Okay, I'll say that.
And he said government inquiry unnecessary, crop circles are a natural phenomenon in his opinion.
We're good.
We're good?
In 1990, the politician Dennis Healy said that he felt a government inquiry into the crop circle phenomenon was unnecessary. He felt this was had natural causes, these patterns. I think he was wrong. I think we would benefit. Sorry.
We'll get there.
Shall I? I paused there anyway, so
I think
I
we were
guess.
wrong
You can start whenever you.
Okay.
Can we pick up after I think he was wrong?
from that line.
Okay, so if you
Okay,
just wanted to get
sure.
that line again, yeah, thank you.
I think he was wrong. I think a government inquiry would be useful. This mystery has been running for some decades now, and it would be a good opportunity to just draw together all the evidence, all the theories, and come up with a definitive official view.
I have to ask you, because this really is the question, what's your personal belief about crop circles? Is it entirely man-made? Is there the possibility of something else there?
My personal view is that some of the early formations, the very simple circles, may well have been meteorological, wind vortices, mini whirlwinds, that sort of thing. Most, if not all, of the patterns, I'm afraid to say, I'm convinced are made by people. But, you know, having run the government's UFO project, I've come across an awful lot of weird things, and I never say never. So I don't entirely rule out the possibility in a tiny percentage of cases of something more exotic going on, but I don't know what that might be.
Is it possible, and maybe you can talk, this is kind of a lead-in, talk about the recent files that were declassified, the UFO files, and whether there was anything there that even remotely related to crop circles, or maybe there will be in the future.
In May 2008, the Ministry of Defence began what will be a 3-year programme to declassify and release its entire archive of UFO files. These files are now being sent from the Ministry of Defence to the National Archives, and in the batches of files that have been released so far, there have been some documents relating to crop circles, and indeed there have been some documents on crop circles that I actually wrote, because the papers from the early 90s are now among the ones being released. Most of the files, of course, cover UFOs, but as I say, in amongst that material, there are documents on crop circles, and it tends to be letters to and from the public, people writing in saying, what does the Ministry of Defence know about crop circles, what do you think's going on, and they'll get a reply from someone like myself. So those are the sorts of crop circle papers that are now being released into the public domain.
Okay. I have to ask you this as well. We've talked about this. A lot of people would say that you represent the disinformation arm of the government regarding crop circles. What's your response to that?
I've signed the Official Secrets Act, and even though I left the Ministry of Defence in 2006, the Act binds me for life. My security oath doesn't end simply because I've left. That said, I am not in any way, as some people believe, the official spokesperson here putting out disinformation, trying to cover up the truth about crop circles, part of some great conspiracy. My difficulty, of course, is in proving a negative, because if I say to people, I am not, in relation to crop circles, giving out disinformation, people that are conspiracy theorists are not going to sort of turn around and say, oh, thanks very much for clearing that up. They are going to say, well, you would say that, wouldn't you?
Are there any researchers in particular who have targeted you in that respect, and how have you dealt with that?
One of the researchers who has, shall we say, a slightly difficult relationship with me is Colin Andrews. I say that, we're actually friends. I was with him recently at a conference in Washington, D.C., and we had a nice chat, we shook hands. We agree to disagree. That said, he's actually written an entire book called Government Circles, which has my photo on the front cover, where I'm cast very much as the bad guy, and he accuses me of having put out a distorted history of the government and the military's involvement in the crop circle mystery. And Colin Andrews believes that there is ample evidence to support extensive interest in crop circles being expressed by members of the royal family, senior politicians, the army, and the Ministry of Defence. My view, and I've responded to Colin on this, is that very often when you're looking at this interest being expressed, it's really personal interest. Yes, maybe Her Majesty the Queen has read a book on crop circles. Maybe military pilots fly over them and take photos. But why aren't they allowed to be as interested as the rest of us? And I think what's happened is Colin has misunderstood and misinterpreted this as implying a level of official involvement and interest that simply isn't there.
Of course, you bring me to this question because Colin has mentioned it. He likes to talk about how Charles and Diana had asked to be given a tour of the circles in the, I believe it was the late 80s. And then once the media got hold of it, according to Colin, they dropped it promptly and refused to acknowledge that it was ever going to happen. Can you comment on that?
Colin Andrews has suggested that Prince Charles and Princess Diana were going to pay a visit to a crop circle, and the plug was pulled on this when word leaked out to the media. I don't know whether that's true or not, but I'm sure there's not necessarily anything sinister about that. I mean, again, we go back to the point that Charles and Diana would be one of tens of thousands of people who've actually enjoyed looking at a crop circle. Why shouldn't they pay a visit? Again, it doesn't imply some sort of sinister government interest. It's just that they thought it would be a fun thing to do, I'm sure. Similarly, it doesn't surprise me that if they got word that the media knew about this, they would pull out. I'm sure they wouldn't want to be at the centre of a field, or indeed anywhere, surrounded by the paparazzi. And of course, it's well known that on a number of occasions, Princess Diana was extremely upset by intrusion from the media, so actively avoided perhaps some situations where she knew that might be something she would encounter.
Yeah. I wanted to touch on this. You say that these days you find yourself investigating UFOs and alien abduction more than crop circles. What interests me is that with both UFOs and alien abductions, it is somewhat subjective. You can't review the data unless you have it on video, and even then you've got a very limited perspective, whereas a crop circle you can get in, you can examine, you can even send it to a lab and it can remain there for months and still be analysed and yield some results. So why less interest in crop circles, which is so easy to examine, they won't fly off on you, and why would you be less inclined to investigate them and more inclined to investigate something like alien abduction, which some people would say is hallucination or hysteria.
I now investigate all sorts of strange mysteries in a private capacity, and really I look at what people tend to contact me about, and it just so happens that more people are contacting me about UFOs and alien abductions at present than crop circles. Of course, there's a school of thought that says with crop circles you've got something tangible that can be investigated in a non-subjective way. In other words, you've got the crop, it's very easy to send it to a laboratory. And yes, I agree with that, and that's probably something I should get more involved with. That said, in some UFO cases, of course, you do have photographs and videos that can be scientifically analysed. In many UFO cases, you've also got these things tracked on radar. So there is some hard science that you can do there as well. As for the alien abduction phenomenon, yes, that's more inclined to be, I think, psychological or psychiatric. But again, it's something that interests me. Whether these people are literally physically being taken into a spaceship or whether there's something else going on to do with the human mind, I just find that vastly interesting. And that's the sort of thing that drives my priorities.
And you say on your website, I'm going to quote you, I understand that the file I opened on crop circles.
Come on, I'm just gonna. This light is just changing. It's coming directly into the room now.
Are we still going though?
Yeah, you can go ahead and just ask the question. Just hold on the answer till I get back.
So I'm just going to quote you. You said, I understand that the file I opened on crop circles, I'm assuming the MOD file, has now been closed, and that the subject is no longer under any form of official consideration. Would that be true to say? Is that the file's closed on crop circles at MOD and no longer being examined in any respect?
There's nothing I can do about that, but you're free to answer it.
Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are you rolling?
Yes, I
Yeah.
am.
Okay.
Yeah.
After I left the UFO project in 1994, my successors, for a number of reasons, didn't take the interest in crop circles that I did. So, yes, it's true that the Ministry of Defence file on crop circles has now been closed and that there's no government study of this going on at all.
I see. Okay, we'll just continue on here. So you do, we touched on this as well. It says, while I am convinced that most pictograms are man-made, we talked about that, I do not entirely rule out other more exotic possibilities. Just talk briefly about what those exotic possibilities might be.
If we're considering exotic explanations for crop circles, in other words, setting aside hoaxing and meteorology, I guess one of the theories that one hears from time to time is earth energies. People point out that many of these crop circles appear very close to ancient sacred sites, which many people believe have power associated with them in some way, whether it's Stonehenge, the circle at Avebury, or various burial mounds, Silbury Hill, for example. There may be something to that theory, there may not be, I don't know.
Actually leads me into the next question. Are you aware of the magnetic anomalies that are often found at these megalithic sites? And well, let's just comment about that first.
I haven't studied in detail the magnetic anomalies sometimes reported with various megalithic sites. Again, this may be a consequence of the stones themselves that are often obviously a central part of these sites, or it may be that in some way aware of these magnetic anomalies, these were the power sites on which the ancients chose to build the memorials and the structures that were most important to them.
Yeah, thank you. And then, just jumping around but staying really kind of on topic, BLT discovered that if seeds were blasted with whatever this crop circle energy is, that they actually got an extremely high yield. The plants grew healthier and they grew faster. That obviously has implications for us today as the world runs out of food and water. Do you think that's again something that MOD or maybe even the Ministry of Agriculture should look at a little more closely?
Researchers such as the BLT consortium have suggested that some of the seeds from crop circle formations, if they're affected by these energies that they believe are there, whatever they may be, produce a greater yield. If that's true, clearly there are huge implications in terms of feeding our planet. And yes, of course, that is something that should be looked at. But again, as with all this BLT research and indeed all the civilian research, it's really no good getting this peer-reviewed by the UFO and crop circle community. It needs to be peer-reviewed by the mainstream scientific community. And it's only then, I think, that we'll start to get answers to these sorts of questions.
So then what happens if Nature or if these scientific publications just decide not to cover it? It seems like we're losing a huge opportunity because of an editorial choice. Is that fair, or is that a smart way to proceed in terms of science and investigation?
If any crop circle researchers write up a paper which can prove that there are changes, for example, in the cellular structure, in the chemical composition of crops from a crop circle formation that are not found outside, then that should be published in the big journals. And I can't believe, if such a paper was written proving this, that it wouldn't be featured somewhere. So I think it's not a question of the editors saying we are choosing for some reason not to run it. I suspect, sadly, the answer is the case is not yet proven.
I covered a lot of stuff here, just let me make sure I haven't missed anything important. This would be a good time to ask you the question. Is there anything you want to add?
We perhaps I'll mention the talk about the farmers and there.
Shotgun.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess I'd ask you. Recently, a farmer was in the news again for crop circle related misbehaviour. Do you want to talk about that and the culture that arises from that?
There has been for some time tension between the farming community and some of the people who A, go and make crop circles, and then B, some of the people who turn up to see them. What's going on is that there are many, many farmers who believe this is nothing short of criminal damage and trespass. In other words, some of their crops are being destroyed. That's costing them several £100s. Then people are coming into the fields illegally, trampling even more of the crops in order to get a look at the formation. Other farmers have taken a more benevolent line, and indeed some farmers have set up honesty boxes in the fields for people to put money in. Others have been a little bit more business-minded about it and have actually put a couple of the farmhands out there with buckets and have charged maybe £1 a time. And I've heard stories of some farmers doing quite well from some of these formations. So I wouldn't entirely rule out some farmers, shall we say, turning a blind eye to people making a very impressive formation on their land. Recently, these tensions between some farmers and the crop circle community have come to a head, and in the last day or so, as I speak to you, there's been a case where a farmer was apparently arrested by the police and found in possession of a shotgun. Now, whether he, as has been alleged, was shooting at one of these people who he believed was either responsible for making the crop circle or trespassing on his fields to go and take a look is still to be determined. I think there are various stories doing the rounds, and it would be improper to speculate if there's going to be a court case pending. But clearly there are important issues here. There's been one conviction, at least in this country, for criminal damage, for someone who was arrested in the act of having made a crop circle. And of course, farmers do have guns. some of them do get upset with people coming on their land without permission, and I hope that we don't have a tragedy.
Okay, and one of the again, you're leading me into nice areas here.
Yeah, we're back.
Okay.
Okay, I'll just do my
Sure.
farmer comment. Some farmers are very angry about people trespassing on their land in relation to the crop circle phenomenon. Just recently, a farmer was arrested for discharging a shotgun at someone who was illegally on his land. Clearly, this was the last straw. You can use that or not. Sorry, I've been working with a national daily newspaper on this story, and
Yeah.
that was what I gave them.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, now back to the serious stuff. Your question about the commercial, some people have a vested interest?
Is there a vested interest in this village industry continuing and thriving and growing every season?
Some people are clearly making money from crop circles. There are books, there are calendars, there's merchandise, there are tours that you can take, sometimes on the ground, sometimes actually in aeroplanes. There are a number of pubs and cafes which market themselves as meeting points for the crop circle community. There's even beer that's been made with crops from within formations. So yeah, I don't rule out the fact that some people have a vested interest in this, and they may at the least turn a blind eye to it, and in some cases perpetuate it.
When you say perpetuate, you mean perhaps even kick back to the hoaxers, encourage them aggressively to go out and continue what they're doing at night?
I have to be careful for legal reasons, and I'm certainly not going to name any names, but I wouldn't rule out the possibility of some of the hoaxing community being commissioned by people with an interest in the phenomenon to go and make some patterns.
We've actually done quite a bit of staking out, and one of the things we discovered is how difficult it is to kind of locate yourself even in the dark, in the middle of the night, when there's cloud cover in these fields. Have you ever gone into a field at night and done some simple tests yourself to see how difficult it is to actually lay down a circle in the dark?
I've not personally gone into a crop circle formation at night to see how easy or difficult it is. I think it depends on who you are. I mean, clearly, if you are brought up in the country, if you're familiar with farmland, for example, you'll find it much easier, particularly on a night where there's moonlight, where you can see your way around. The other factor to consider is that some of these people making crop formations are using fairly sophisticated equipment, and I've certainly heard reports of people using night vision goggles. I've heard reports of people having global positioning systems to actually check their location.
I have one other question actually relating to something you said on your site in July 1992. You said, "I did manage to acquire a soil sample that had come from within a strange ground marking that had appeared on private land, and I sent it for analysis via specialist staffs. But before the analysis was undertaken, I discovered that the pattern on the ground had a mundane explanation." I just wondered, what was that mundane explanation that prohibited you from doing this simple soil study?
I had a bizarre case in 1992 where an elderly woman sent me a soil sample from within a crop circle. So I consulted some of my colleagues in the Defence Intelligence staff, and we sent the soil off for analysis. But the woman concerned was quite elderly and had not really understood what crop circles were. And it transpired that this was actually from her lawn, and her gardener had been making circular patterns in the grass. So, of course, immediately we stopped the investigation.
That's a very funny answer.
Yeah.
Bite my tongue there a little bit. I guess we'd like to ask you about, just because it kind of ties in, UFO activity in Britain in the last 5 to 10 years. Has there been an increase? Is this growing in your opinion?
There's been a sharp increase in the number of UFO sightings in Britain in recent years. The 2008 figures were over double those for 2007. I'm talking about the Ministry of Defence figures here. Of course, the real figures are much higher because the MOD aren't the only people collating statistics on this. So far in 2009, there have been almost as many sightings as the entire previous year. So again, the trend is upwards. UFO sightings in Britain are currently certainly at a 10-year high. We may be on course this year or next to break the record completely.
How do you... I'm not up, but what do you think is going on here? Is it the public becoming more aware, or is the phenomenon expanding?
There are three possible explanations for the increase in UFO sightings here in Britain. The first is that public interest in this has reached a new level because of media stories about the release of the MOD UFO files, and that's encouraged people who've had sightings to come forward. The second reason is that so-called Chinese lanterns, little mini fire balloons, are increasingly popular in this country. They're used at weddings, barbecues, parties, and they clearly account for quite a large number of sightings. The third possibility is, of course, that we are simply seeing more strange things in our skies.
I've got to ask you, who do you think these UFOs are? Are they extraterrestrials? Could this be secret government stealth programs? Would you like to comment on that?
Sorry, I will after I...
Yeah, let's not get into it. Yeah, we'll wait.
We're being just assaulted on all fronts here, light, sound.
Right. By the way, I was just curious if you were aware that Crutchfield's this year, I think,
It's also
it's on track to
record.
be a
Yeah.
new record. There's
Right.
Yeah.
almost been as many as all of last
Right.
year already this year.
Right.
So perhaps we can mention that.
Okay.
That there is a correlation, at least in terms of activity.
Light's good.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Okay.
Whenever you're ready.
Sure, sorry, what was the
Oh.
question?
So my question would be, do you feel there's a correlation between the increase in UFO sightings and the tremendous increase in crop circle activity this year?
Despite the link that many people draw between the crop circle phenomenon and the UFO phenomenon, I'm not that sure there is a link. But it is nonetheless interesting that crop circle patterns seem to also be heading for an all-time high, along with UFO sightings. Oh, you asked me about UFOs. Yes, that was the question. I forgot.
Yes. That was. Who do you think these beings are? Do you want to comment?
Okay. Most UFO sightings turn out to be simple misidentifications of ordinary objects and phenomena, aircraft lights, satellites, meteors, weather balloons, etc. A small number of them appear to defy any conventional explanation. Some people think that they might be secret government aircraft or drones. I think that's unlikely. These sorts of things are tested in very clearly defined military test areas, and we know where we fly these things. Other people think that there might be some sort of exotic atmospheric phenomenon that science hasn't yet completely understood. Atmospheric physicists talk about plasmas, for example. There may be something to that. Of course, a number of people believe that some UFO sightings might be extraterrestrial, and again, if you'll forgive the politician's answer, I can't rule that out, but neither have I seen any hard proof that would validate that theory.
So, what, in your opinion, how likely is it that we're going to have contact in our lifetimes of some kind with a non-terrestrial?
I think that within our lifetimes, it's very possible that... Oh, sorry, I'm guessing you can hear that.
Yeah, sorry.
It'll trade.
So, possibility
Okay.
of contact.
Almost there.
Sorry, just tell me when, Alex.
As good as it'll get. Yeah, sounds good.
like many scientists, I'm firmly of the belief that there are other intelligent civilizations in our universe. Ours may be the first generation to obtain the proof of this, but I think that proof is more likely to come through radio astronomy, in other words, picking up a signal, than actually through some great landing.
I'll ask you one more time if there's anything you want to add, because we've covered a lot of stuff.
No,
I have a question regarding helicopters and low flight flying. What exactly is qualified for low flying, especially over public land or private land? Because I have personally seen some footage where 30 feet off the ground.
Okay.
I mean, enough to really knock the bejesus out of those little tiny planes.
Okay.
So,
there are very strict rules about low-flying military aircraft. Generally speaking, for fixed-wing aircraft, the rule is you can't fly below 250 feet, and even then you've got to be in designated low-flying areas. Under some exceptional circumstances, jet aircraft can come down lower, I think to 100 feet, but that's very rare. Helicopters can actually, of course, go right down to the ground. So low flying for a helicopter can be 5, 10, 15 feet above the ground in some circumstances. And indeed, the whole point of what these people are training for is very often landing very quickly to either drop off or pick up troops and then dusting off again within a matter of seconds.
Like Ryan was saying, we saw this happen at West Kent Long Barrow. We were wondering, do the military have to ask permission from the landowner to do that kind of low-level flying?
Generally speaking, the military, if they're flying, say, at 250 feet, don't need the landowner's permission. But with helicopter training, where you go lower than that, and particularly, of course, in instances where you actually land in the fields, yes, you do need the permission from the landowner, and indeed many farmers are quite happy and regard it as doing their bit for the country, because of course the low-flying training that these helicopter pilots do in England is going to be put to use and may save lives in places like Iraq and Afghanistan.
Great. Another question I have based on that, it's just fascination I have with helicopters, but it's this is not to draw any conclusions or anything, but I'm quite aware, as you mentioned earlier, that Wiltshire, I can't pronounce it, is a very big military presence as far as land ownership and things like that. Why is landing a helicopter in public or private fields any more beneficial than using their thousands and thousands of acres of their own land?
The military, of course, has its own training areas where it can and does do a lot of flying activity. But the point is that pilots need to train for terrain that they're not familiar with, as well as the areas that they are, because out in Iraq and Afghanistan, very often they'll be tasked to go to a location that they've never been to before. So the worst thing you want is a pilot getting into a routine and training only on an area that he or she is familiar with.
If they did use the crop circles as navigational markers, wouldn't they, if they were doing this, because it could be at night, let's not forget, wouldn't they use instrumental kind of navigation, using their instruments and instead of, let's say, a land marker?
Pilots will use both instrument flying and the naked eye to navigate and fly. In the pilot community, you sometimes talk about cockpit aware and outside aware. So yes, you certainly use your instruments to judge your location and things, but no pilot will ever exclusively rely just on the dials and the data that they're getting. There's no substitute for actually looking out and seeing where you are.
Great. I'm going to do the same.
Okay.
I'm rolling.
Okay, so possible health benefits of being in a crop circle. Can you comment?
there's some anecdotal evidence to suggest that crop circles might have healing powers, but I think there's a more rational explanation here, and the placebo effect is well documented. So I think if you're dealing with people who are ill, but who are of that new age belief, as many who are likely to be the people visiting crop circles are, then effectively what's happening is that they believe that the crop circle will help them, and indeed it will. The power of positive thought has been well documented as having an effect, a beneficial effect on health.
We have at least one formation. It's the Julius set that came down in, I want to say, 97, opposite Stonehenge. Are you familiar with that?
Yes, in fact I've got a poster of it on my wall
Okay.
in my office.
Well, the Julius set really interests me because according to reports from 3 separate people, a pilot, a policeman and a farmer, I believe, it appeared within about 45 minutes across the street from Stonehenge in broad daylight. Do you want to comment on that and how that might happen?
Several witnesses claim that the famous Julia set formation that was laid out close to Stonehenge appeared in really a matter of 45 minutes, an hour at the most. Now, that would be interesting, and if that's true, that's precisely the reason why even myself, who's broadly sceptical on this, say, well, I don't entirely rule out some of these more exotic possibilities.
So you'd say that is beyond the capability of hoaxes to create that formation in 45 minutes in broad daylight without being noticed?
I would find it very, very difficult. I'm not going to say impossible, but very difficult to see any way in which hoaxers could lay down a formation in broad daylight close to such a major tourist site without being seen.
Ryan, do you have a question?
Yeah, my question, shoot, I just forgot it. It was in regards to, oh yes, we met a farmer. I think I heard you talk about this upstairs. We met a farmer who claims that the MOD did a study. Do you want to explain that? Did you explain that upstairs? Or?
I did, yeah.
Yeah.
It's the Morgan's Hill farmer.
Right.
And he said MOD came out about 15 years ago and they had lasers up on the Druid Circle on the tree line at the top, and then they had people surveying the field, and they had motion detector equipment that was quite sophisticated, and they apparently a heavy mist came down during their stakeout over the night, and when the mist retreated there was a circle in their presence. Do you know anything about that case? Does it ring a bell?
Sorry, before I answer, is this Operation Blackbird? Is
You
that,
tell me.
yeah, I'm just trying to remember. Well, look, I won't call it Operation Blackbird in case that's wrong. But
could you talk about Blackbird though? Because that's
Oh, well,
something-
maybe.
no, I can't because I can't remember what year it was. But okay, let me kind of address that.
Okay.
One farmer and several crop circle researchers claim that the military have turned up on occasion and conducted very detailed investigations of crop circles. I'm not aware of that, and certainly I don't think it happened while I was on the UFO project. It's possible that this was a military exercise unconnected with crop circles, but they just happened to be there. For example, special forces will sometimes train in things like surveillance. That's one option. Another possibility is that there are an awful lot of people in the crop circle hoaxing community who have what you would describe as paramilitary gear, really. I mean, of course, to make these formations in the first place, they often dress up in camouflage and have night vision goggles, GPS, etc., etc. There are also, it's well known, a number of people in the country who, through some psychological condition, for example, pretend to be police officers, pretend to be paramedics. Sorry, I'll do that again.
No worries.
There's also a well-known psychological phenomenon where some people enjoy impersonating, for example, police officers, impersonating paramedics, and these people go to the lengths of getting the uniforms, the vehicles, behaving exactly as the real police officers and paramedics would. I don't rule out the possibility that some people are doing the same with the military. After all, what could be, if you were a fantasy-prone personality, more glamorous than pretending to be a member of a secret unit investigating crop circles for the government?
Okay. Let's see. What is Operation Blackbird? Let's just say,
Sure.
From what we described, not only what is Operation Blackbird, but from what we described, let's just, have you done anything like that while you were there?
Okay. Operation Blackbird was an attempt by the crop circle research community to mount a covert surveillance on a field where many formations had appeared in previous years. Now, they claimed, firstly, that a formation did indeed appear in the field that they were watching. They subsequently claimed that there was military interest in this. I don't rule out the fact that, obviously the crop circle did appear, but I suspect that word had gotten around and that some of the hoaxers thought, well, if we can put down a circle right under these guys' noses, we'll really have pulled something spectacular off, and I suspect that's exactly what they did. As to the accusations of military involvement, D-notices, etc., again, I think we're on more shaky ground here. I think we're either dealing with stories that simply aren't true, we may be dealing with unrelated military exercises, for example, special forces, or something quite prosaic.
So Operation Blackbird was not military?
Operation Blackbird was not a military operation. It was a civilian initiative at which it was subsequently claimed there was some military interest and involvement.
And this was claimed by Colin Andrews, correct?
Yeah.
Have you, at your time at the MOD, have you ever headed any kind of special surveillance or any special things other than after the fact, showing up and looking or talking to people?
I would have liked to have organised a surveillance, covert surveillance of some of these fields where formations have appeared over several years. I would have liked to have then conducted a proper laboratory analysis of soil samples and crops, but again, these were very difficult issues in terms of the small budget we had, and any of that work would have had to have been at the expense of my primary duty of researching and investigating the UFO phenomenon.
I have another question. I know that you have since left the government, but how do you feel about it now? Would you urge whoever is there at the government now to, you said you would like to have done this, would you recommend or have a personal just urge of whoever is taking your place or whoever is there now to do these things?
I would like to see the government look into this phenomenon, and I think despite the difficulties, particularly in the current economic climate, I think a case could be made that you could easily use existing resources on such a study. Special forces are always doing surveillance exercises. Why not put them in a field and see if they can catch whoever or whatever is making these crops? The laboratories, the government has laboratories, for example, to look at food hygiene issues. These are the sorts of labs that could quite easily analyse crops and soil samples from these formations. So it would be easy and cheap to do, and yes, I think the government should do it.
That's a great bite, yeah.
Yeah, that was really good. That was a good bite. Yeah. I think that's it for me. Do you have?
No, or can you get? I'm gonna stop the cameras and maybe we'll just take a 2-minute just to let everything settle. And if we're still at this
Can we
stage,
give Nick a break on